Hello, beautiful community. We're going to talk about broad-ranging issues around Mr. Navalny getting his sentence extended by 19 years. Here's a little menu of what I want to briefly and casually mention today. The sentence itself, Mr. Navalny's character, some of Mr. Navalny's recent statements, and what they mean for change or revolution in Russia. Mr. Navalny's program, very briefly, and criticism of Mr. Navalny for colonialism and nationalism. So the sentence doesn't matter because Mr. Navalny is going to be in jail in harsh conditions as long as Mr. Putin is in power. Now, there is a psychological question there, which is how micro is Mr. Putin's curation of Mr. Navalny's fate. Mr. Putin is curating Mr. Navalny's fate, but if it's happening on a more micro level than we might imagine, then that adds a particular level of deep sickness. Now, a question arises, why isn't Mr. Navalny killed? And there are going to be two directions in which to go here. One is obviously just the inconvenience of killing him now. And the other is a conversation about scenarios in which the regime is weakening, and being in a weakened position could benefit from having an alive Navalny to deal with, to exploit, to negotiate with, and so on. Let's say a word about Navalny's character. I think I've spoken at greater length about Navalny, so I'll just be brief. Navalny is a romantic with a capital R. His best quality is that this romantic trait is authentic to him and gives him the possibility to feel free even though he is in chains. That's a rare quality. Mr. Navalny is exhaustingly ambitious. He has his political aspirations, and almost with every little thing he does, there's a little mechanism in his head which asks, is doing this going to get me closer to the outcome I want? And cartoonishly, the outcome may be gaining power in Russia. Is the way I'm going to lift this cup of coffee going to bring me a quarter of a millimeter closer to where I want to go? And if not, I'm not going to lift the coffee up that way. Right? So there's a kind of almost a nauseating relentlessness around squeezing out every inch on his way toward his goals. Talent-wise, Mr. Navalny is a good politicizer. He is good at coming onto a landscape and increasing the degree of activity there, increasing the degree of conflict there, both constructive and unconstructive conflict. And now that means that Mr. Navalny is rather unlike other people in his organization who are investigators, broadcasters, activists. But it's not clear that they're politicians. Mr. Navalny is a politician, right? It's a neutral statement. I'm not encouraging you to like or dislike his politics when I say that. I'm saying he's a political animal. Now, let's have a brief peek at a couple of Mr. Navalny's recent statements. Here is Navalny just before the sentence. The sentence will be read in 24 hours, and I want to say several words. It's going to be a huge Stalinist term. And when the figure is announced, please understand that the main purpose here is to intimidate you, not me. I'll even say this: you personally are the target of the intimidation. You who is reading these words. Next, he says, we know for sure that if 1 in 10 of those outraged by the corruption of the Putin regime came out onto the streets, the government would fall. We know for sure that if those who oppose the war came out onto the street, the government would fall, the war would stop. Now, of course, there is a sense, he says, in which it doesn't really work like that. But the point is, somebody has to be first, he says, and it's scary to be the first. All changes are achieved by 10% of citizens, the most active ones. That is you. He goes on. We always help Putin's strategy of intimidation by throwing hysterics and clutching at our hearts over every arrest. And we mustn't forget anyone who is arrested. But at the same time, we must firmly realize that power in Russia has been usurped and illegally seized. And we should understand this cold-bloodedly. Putin must not achieve his goal. Therefore, my second request, right, on top of understanding that this is aimed at intimidating you, is when the sentence is announced, think about only one, have only one really important thought. What can I personally do to resist? And the third request is, when answering this question, do not say nothing. Because you surely can do something. Talk to your neighbors, put up a flyer, share with others our investigations, send money, do a blog, support political prisoners, do graffiti, go to a rally. There is no shame in choosing the safest way to protest, but there is shame in doing nothing. It's shameful to let yourself be intimidated. And I think then after the sentence, he says, the figure here is not for me, it's for you. You, not me, are being frightened by this, and the attempt is to deprive you of the will to resist. You're being forced to surrender your country to these a-holes. Don't let Putin achieve his goals. Do not lose the will to resist. Now, let me say something about what Navalny is wanting to convey to Russians, and in particular Russians who might be in Russia. Number one, stay sane. Number two, you're not alone, right? There are others. But of course, there is also an attempt at politicization here. And is this attempt strong, the attempt we've just read, right? No, it's really, really weak, which is a reflection of the challenges somebody like Mr. Navalny faces at the moment in politicizing the Russian space. It's something he's very committed to, but it's something that's hard to do. Just think of this comment that if only 10% of us, came out, this regime would be gone. Let's think for a moment of Lenin. I'll tell you briefly 3 things about Lenin's conception of political transformation. Now, of course, when you do think about politics properly, you create lineages of traditions in your head, of construct traditions of thinkers that are not based on their ideological slant. So you could have, a lineage of people who influence you, for example, that might contain centrist liberals and people from the hard left and the hard right at the same time. To the uninitiated in political thought, that might feel strange, but of course it isn't. So Lenin, in fact, despite his ideological predicament, is in many ways continuous with the Machiavellian Thucydides in the history of Western political thought. There are three things that are relevant to what Navalny is doing here that Lenin thought. Lenin thought that, number one, abstract moral ideas and abstract political concepts do not help anybody, right? The way you construct a political concept, right, has to be itself immediately responsive to the political realities you face, not to some kind of theoretical pressures that you might experience in the ivory tower. No, a political concept has to be responsive to the priority of political needs in the world around you. Well, number one. Number two, all analysis of politics is itself a political act, right? All political theorization, all political speculation is a political act. And number three, revolutions don't get made. They happen, and then they're joined by the relevant agents, right? So where are we going with this? Lenin would say there is no politics in what Navalny has just said, right? It's a therapeutic form of fabricated optimism. There's nothing politically constructive in that remark. If only 10% came out, then everything would change. Now, what is Navalny's program? Let's read a couple of things from a 15-point statement Navalny came up with some months ago. Ukraine first. What are Ukraine's borders? They're similar to Russia's. They're the internationally recognized and defined borders in 1991. Right? Russia also recognized these borders back then, and it must recognize them as well today. So Crimea is Ukrainian. We'll come back to Navalny's history with this when we get to the criticism. Together with Ukraine and other world powers, we must look for an acceptable way to compensate the damage done to Ukraine. War crimes must be prosecuted in cooperation with international institutions. Are all Russians inherently imperialistic? This is nonsense, and we shouldn't overestimate this. Come back to that later. Now, toward domestic politics, we need to dismantle the Putin regime and its dictatorship, ideally through conducting general free elections and convocating the Constitutional Assembly. We need to establish a parliamentary republic based on the alteration of powers through fair elections, independent courts, federalism, local self-governance, and complete economic freedom and social justice. Recognizing our history and traditions, we must be part of Europe and follow the European path of development. So this emphasis on decentralization and federalization is relatively new for Navalny, and it certainly makes his proposals saner at being in friction with reality. However, while Mr. Navalny's answer is Russia must be a modern democratic republic, roughly, there are very serious questions to be asked, both about the substance of these proposals, right, and whether they come out looking good if one assesses them both for their efficacy as being themselves a political intervention and for their sanity at the level of being vaguely in the ballpark of where, under very ideal conditions, the Russian political space might move. There is still in Mr. Navalny's thought a very naive idea of the civilized world and the West and liberal democracy. And Navalny is himself capable of saying, and he often does say, Russia needs to be a normal country, right? And we made a video on the main channel about the fact that it's actually problematic for the Russian opposition to keep saying that they want Russia to be a normal country, right? That's to say that if one's analysis of the West, the challenges that the West is facing, indeed is really shallow and glib, your analysis of what is possible, best case scenario on the Russian space isn't going to be very convincing, right? I won't discuss the corruption business because, of course, his team is typically in the mode of corruption investigations. And there's a good question of how far this is appropriate at a time like this, right? And part of the answer is going to have to be that they readjust. Part of the answer is going to have to be that there can be a story about the Russian the economy of discourse, the term we often use, of the Russian opposition is plural, and some people may be talking about corruption there, and that potentially could be fine. But that again reveals the non-political nature of Mr. Navalny's colleagues, right? In contrast to Mr. Navalny, who is indeed himself a political animal. So very roughly, decentralization, federalization, radical economic reform, put on the table in broad brush strokes, is going to be congenial. Is going to be congenial to Navalny, but that's a very terribly vague level at which to discuss this, right? Does Mr. Navalny want the breakup of Russia? No, he absolutely does not. He wants a decentralization. Now, how does one get deeper than that? Well, I think there are two questions to ask. For the domestic context, a question is, what holds all the Russian people, all the people living on the Russian space together? Right? And that is not a philosophical question. That's a question to which we don't necessarily know the answer. And what will happen on the Russian space will itself be an answer that history delivers us to that question. At the moment, no Russian political leader is raising or answering that question. Another question is, how does Mr. Navalny get the West to boost him as he tries to politicize the Russian space, right? That's a question for the Russian opposition in general, one that has been in practice underexploited. Let's look now briefly at criticism of Mr. Navalny for historical unlovely statements of a hard nationalist kind, and the accusations of imperialism when, for instance, in 2014 he came out and said that while the annexation of Crimea is illegal and unacceptable, Crimea isn't something that can just be isn't a sandwich. It can't just be returned to Ukraine overnight. Now, I think here there is a difference between whether you are a Ukrainian saying that and whether you are, I don't know, Hubert in Buckinghamshire sitting and saying that. Now, why do I say that there's a difference? Because unqualified rage at all things Russian is to an extent understandable, right? Coming from Ukrainians. And Ukrainians also have very important informational purposes to meet at home, right? To keep the country going through this. Now, some of these purposes might be constructive, others might be destructive, unconstructive. But these are really challenging things that Ukraine has to get right, has to get through. So there's a special sort of leeway there about what might be okay being said. However, if we have Hubert from Buckinghamshire going on Telegram and Twitter every day and saying that Mr. Navalny is an evil colonialist and that all Russians are orcs, then we've got a problem, right? And at the moment I'm working alone on YouTube, but if I had a team and there were members of the beautiful community like Hubert, we would have to track them down and explore putting them on the naughty step. We'd have a look and say, well, what did Hubert do on Tuesday? Okay, he said orcs 47 times. What about Monday? Orcs 50 times. And Navalny is a colonialist 23 times. I mean, Hubert's on fire. I mean, the guy is really, really on fire. I just think over these 2 days alone, he's done more to help Ukraine than an F-16 could. So, what am I saying here? I'm saying here that nobody is voting for Mr. Navalny. Mr. Navalny is a guy in jail, right? So nobody's being asked to rate him as a candidate for political office. Nobody's being asked about whether they would feel positive voting for him. Nobody's being asked about whether they would feel good if he were the president of Russia. Mr. Navalny is a political prisoner. He is, to a certain extent, a kind of bomb underneath the Putin regime. He has genuine, organic support in Russia. And the question for Ukraine is, can you use that or not? Is Navalny politically effective? A tool that's politically effective for you? Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. So what's your project, right? What do you want to see happen on the Russian space? And can you exploit this Navalny guy in any way to get you closer to what you want to achieve, whatever it is? That's politics, right? Oh, Navalny has 7 views and 6 of them are evil and 2 are too colonial and 3 are too nationalist. That is apolitical consumerism. That is you shopping for something that isn't being sold to you, right? And that's why I think there's this big ethical difference about whether you do that as a Ukrainian and whether you do that as Hubert in Buckinghamshire. When Hubert in Buckinghamshire does it, it's an invasion of politics, which is ironically the very thing that we are so struck about how bad the depoliticized blob in the middle in Russia, how badly they express that political pathology. But Hubert in Buckinghamshire is doing the same. And this is not just a problem about Hubert not supporting Ukraine effectively or not understanding the war effectively, not understanding Russian politics effectively. It's depoliticized engagement with politics, which I can guarantee will also affect the way Hubert does his domestic politics. And so that's the real answer. The point isn't that Mr. Navalny needs to be found guilty of these accusations or vindicated in relation to them. We can have that conversation in a bit more detail if you like, but the point is that conversation is is number 17 on the scale of what's important, right? It's just not political. The politics is how can we use this, right? And I'm sitting here. Let's get very selfish, right? I'm a British citizen, and quite frankly, I am. I have certain interests about what happens in Britain, but I also have some interests about what happens in Europe, right? And whatever occurs in the Russian space influences this, right? Influences my security, for example, right? Or influences the lives of people whose security I might care about, for example, Ukrainians, right? So is Mr. Navalny potentially useful to me, right, in achieving some of my political aims? Do I want the British government to say, well, hey, this is what we want to happen on the Russian space. This is what will make us safer, for example, right? And we'll work toward that, right? So that's the political approach, right, that transcends the depoliticization of trying to score Navalny out as though he were a politician you're voting for, or as though he were a product you're buying. Here you're engaged, right, in responding to an offer that isn't being made to you, right? So that's the basic rant about all of this point scoring that happens around Navalny's credentials. Let's do politics seriously. Lots of love. Talk soon.